In my last video, we looked at the revised Flesheater Court lore that saw the pitiless army of cannibals react to the changing Age of Sigmar landscape, that they see the ascendancy of death as a resplendent period. They loved the rise of the Night Haunt, and are growing their courts faster than ever with the increase in carnage. But as I said before, one thing always stuck out to me in the old book. Each court seemed very small and isolated, nearly always being led by a single ghoul king, being the sole source of the delusion of that specific court. Their origins were tied to the bigger narrative, but they always just kind of felt like this side thing, right? They're not really affected by what's going on in the bigger narrative, or, more importantly, they're not contributing to it. How many books did we see from Black Library that involved Flesheater courts? Not a ton, to be honest with you, because they weren't an events-driving army. Well, one of the best things about the new Battle Tome was their kind of course correction to this. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This course correction came from a new concept called Grand Courts. Everything we learned about how courts function in the first book remains true. And again, I will keep plugging it. I did a video series for a week-long thing a couple months before this book dropped, and all that information is still accurate, and I'll leave a link to it down below. Go check it out. This idea of grand courts are what you get when individual courts all band together, or when one court grows so big it expands its borders and replicates. It sends off, an envoy and sets up a new location somewhere else. And so we'll go back to my favorite part of the Flesheater courts army, and that is perception versus reality. The way that the Flesheater courts see it is, our lush and fertile lands have been constantly under siege, and our neighboring countrymen have always been just and kind, and they share in our plight, so let's unite our efforts and form one secure kingdom. And just to make sure everything goes well and that things are balanced, we're going to install a new ruler and kind of pool our powers together. Or it could be, our society is booming, right? Business is good. We now have too many mouths to feed, so let's seek out new lands of plenty, and expand our honorable empire. And of course, those are two really rose-tinted glasses things, but what's actually happening is that two courts of cannibalistic mongrels bump into each other, and their delusions kind of meld. One arborant ghoul king ends up on top, in control of the two courts now, and each of them has a lesser ghoul king below him. That's an instance where two courts, they come into each other, and one of the delusions is just stronger. Maybe it's a stronger vampire leading it, and his subsumes the delusion of the other. Or with the second scenario, a single court grows so big that it literally just cannot feed all of the ghouls that it has. No matter how much they eat, they just need more and more food. So the ghoul king will make a pair of heirs for his kingdom, split his court in two, and then rules over both of them. Therefore, you get a grand court, that is, a king and his own province and courtiers ruling over a collection of smaller courts, spread far and wide, even from realm to realm. A ghoul king is a deranged vampire. His reign is theoretically endless, so this process of absorbing courts or multiplying his own never truly ends. And the idea of grand courts allows Flesheater courts to retain their isolated identity and feel, because they do individually self-govern, right? They all have a ghoul king there, but also allows for them to have massive impact on huge parts of the realms. It amplifies their reach and influence, and by extension, their threat. No longer is it this small, isolated tribe with no backup, no support, nothing like that. No, and now it's part of a grander thing, and so an Archregent can pull multiple courts into combat. It makes them bigger and scarier. And each grand court has its own character, delusion, strengths, weaknesses, etc. Because really all they did was add a new tier of leadership, but doing so makes Flesheater courts seem like a much larger and imposing army. So let's dig into those grand courts now. The first is called the Morgaunt Grand Court. Originating from some of the prime inner lands of Shyish, the Morgaunt Grand Court has since exploded in size and scope. In the Age of Myth, they were a huge self-governing society of men and women, humans mostly, on the open plains of the realm. They had a really good, resplendent, honor-based, merit-based society that rewarded bravery, sacrifice, and duty. They were a chivalrous people, paying respect to one another. Even the undead that walked around them, because they are in Shyish after all, were treated with honor and reverence. And this respect is what led them to side with Nagash after his betrayal of the god pantheon at the Battle of the Burning Skies. Now, to kind of explain that, because it is a little bit relevant here, the Battle of the Burning Skies was this big push by all the chaos gods pulling their sources, and then all the pantheon of good gods, meaning good in some pretty strong air quotes there, but all the gods that we know from the old world, coming together, uniting, and pushing back the tide of chaos. The thing is, Nagash thought that he could take on chaos himself, but the biggest threat was this pantheon, so he ducked out, let chaos smash the good guys, and then Nagash's plan was to then bring up his armies with all the dead, and then push back chaos and be the sole god and ruler. This betrayal really ticked off Sigmar, who then left that event so mad that he forgot about the chaos gods and stormed on Shyish. He was headhunting Nagash. Now, sadly, the kingdom or the empire that spawned the Morgant Grand Court was kind of on the way of that campaign. This is now Sigmar tearing a hole straight through Shyish to go find Nagash. Their empire was crushed, scattered, and crumbled, remnants all scraping to survive in the aftermath, and that made them prime targets for the Carrion King, which, if you remember from the earlier videos I did, he was unleashed on the realms because Sigmar was very flippant in who he attacked when he walked on Shyish, and he actually freed the Carrion King by accident. So not only did he free the Carrion King, making him a part of the Flesheater Court's origin stories, and then he destroyed this huge empire that the Carrion King then founded the Morgant Grand Court with. So this entire thing is all Sigmar's fault right here. And what this does is it makes the Morgant Court, first of all, one of the oldest of its kind. Like, it would have been pretty much formed at the exact same time as the Carrion King was unleashed. And it certainly has the most direct relationship to their sire. Like, the closer you are in lineage to the Carrion King, the stronger your delusion is, the more powerful you are, and that is no different here. They still see the dead husk of their fallen empire as lush and fertile fields full of bountiful harvests. They aggressively spawn new courts across every realm to push back what they perceive as evil, with a particular hatred for Sigmar, of course, who spawned all of these events upon them. Conversely, they view Nagash as their patron and god, and they truly believe that he could have struck down chaos by himself if not for Sigmar's meddling. At least in Shyish, right? He could have kept Shyish safe from the forces of chaos. Now, I like this one. It requires history lessons, if you will. You have to know about the Carrion King's origins as well as what happened in the Battle of the Burning Skies. But what I think is really cool about this is it ties their origins so deeply into the events of the greater story arc that I just think it's so cool. The idea of, Nagash made a bad choice at the Battle of Burning Skies. Sigmar lost his stuff over it and came barreling after him, and in the aftermath, he incidentally spawned a new breed of evil by unleashing the Carrion King and then giving him an empire right there to start his army with. I love that very much unintentional cause and effect in how these things relate to one another kind of story arc. Also interesting enough, it is the only real time that we see true consequences for Sigmar's actions in Shyish. It's been mentioned in several books, like, oh yeah, he was so mad at Nagash that he stormed Shyish to find him, ignoring the chaos stuff. And up until this point, the only real ramifications for that, because he didn't really kill Nagash, the only real consequences was just that he wasn't fighting chaos, and chaos kind of got a foothold, which is, it's cool, but it's not like a direct relation. Like, there's no way to know that Sigmar would have stopped those things. But when you look at this and it's like, no, he had a true effect. Like, there is a new army and a new threat to his kingdom because of his actions. I like that. Now, the next up is the Hollowam Grand Court. This is an interesting one, and if not a lot more vague. Most of the details are a mystery, and it's more of a premise for an army than a true origin story, you could say. In a long-dead empire, there once was a glorious emperor, good, just, and altruistic. He would go from kingdom to kingdom and kind of help them mend fences with their neighbors and build people up. He was just a good guy. And along his travels from kingdom to kingdom, he would collect artifacts of power. Some that would raise his people up, some that he kept because they were just too dangerous for folks to have. To protect them, he hid these artifacts in a series of vaults across the realm. I believe it's the realm of metal. and only the defenders of these vaults knew their location, but not necessarily what was in them. So you load everything up into a vault, you assign some knights or a knightly household to defend it. They don't need to know what's actually inside. Well, when the Age of Chaos began, Chaos armies poured into the area en masse. The knights, the defenders, were dispatched to go out and secure these vaults. Again, they're full of incredibly powerful artifacts. However, this is basically a suicide mission. They were outgunned, outmatched, and they were continually harassed and repelled from getting to their goal. Their crusades became long excursions, a cat and mouse game with chaos, and their supplies ran low. First, they ate the peasants for food, thinking that they couldn't eat their horses because without horses they couldn't fulfill their mission, which was the whole point of all of this sacrifice. And then as time went on, they had to eat the horses. And this is actually what broke them, because now they've sacrificed so much to accomplish their oath of defending these vaults. And now at this point, they can't do that. But what does that mean for the sacrifices you made to this point? All that kind of stuff just mentally breaks them. And in that moment of desperation, as happens across several realms, an Arborant Ghoul King nearby steps in. And to this day, they still crusade to locate and defend those treasures of old, fulfilling their oaths of loyalty to their emperor. Only now, they are a terrible vision of what they once were, where they see themselves riding up high on horseback as these heroes and knights. Truth of the matter is, they're ugly, horrific cannibals that have only gotten larger because most of this grand court is comprised of crypt horrors. So they see themselves up high because they think they're on a horse. They're actually just super tall crypt horrors. And this one is interesting. It definitely gives you a narrative reason to have a very nomadic army as they keep trying to move and find these vaults. It is, like I said, definitely more of a premise, like a sales pitch for an army, than it is like a fleshed out origin story, but that has pros and cons with it as well. So it is a very cool concept of an ever-moving, ever-vigilant knightly order comprised mostly of crypt horrors. Next up are the Blister Skin Grand Court, and I'm just gonna throw it out there. This is my favorite one. They are instantly recognizable from their red, burning, and rotting skin. This Grand Court has its origins in Akshi, though they have spread to all corners of the realms. The kingdom that would spawn them worshipped the sun itself. And it makes a lot of sense since the heat and the sun were dominant features in their particular area of Akshi. By way of worship, every time they did their harvest annually, they would sacrifice 1/3 of their crops to burn up. They were humble, religious, and extremely evangelistic, meaning they would go to other kingdoms and preach their beliefs and try to get other cultures to join them in worshiping the sun. These other kingdoms they mentioned by name. A few of them are Batar, Asperia, and Algoraxi. When chaos came, it struck these followers fiercely. They were driven from their homes and their crops. That with no harvest to sacrifice, they began offering their own weaklings to the sun god, and they were beleaguered and on the run, and the fall to madness was not hard. In their delusion, now, they see themselves as enlightened, that the sun they feared and worshipped has become their patron and their deliverer. They don't hide from its rays anymore. They're able to walk in the radiance of its warmth without being hurt, and dedicate themselves to sharing the good news of the sun god. In reality, they've become, of course, the Flesheater court. They're too sick to know that the harsh sun is cooking them alive. Their skin is blistered, dry, peeling, glowing red, where they evangelize, in heavy air quotes there, massive hordes of ghouls descend to feast. When they attack, they still offer up ceremonial sacrifices, leaving 1/3 of the dead as a huge gore pile for the sun to consume. And I like this one because there's some real character here, right? They have that cool religious tone and offers some chance to move away from the Arthurian legend titles like knights and courts and, and those kinds of things. But you can go more into like cult-like names and those kinds of stuff. Have that more religious tone towards them. One thing I did like is that the 3 places that we mentioned, Batar, Asperia, and Algoraxi, if you look at the core book for Age of Sigmar when it tackles the realm of Akshi and gives a history, those are actually really important places, as the drama that those countries or nation states have gives birth to the Khorne presence in Akshi. The reason it's dominated by Khorne, at least till the events starting Age of Sigmar, is because those nation states brought it about. So I like it. It gives them a real place inside the realms and interacts with historical things that we've already heard about. The last of the Grand Courts is called the Gristlegore Grand Court, probably the most infamous from their tabletop exploits, but also has some of the lightest bits of lore about them. We know they originate from the lands of Gur, and they were originally formed from a society called the Tranquil Kingdoms, a large and nomadic tribe that lived at relative peace within their environment, which in Gur is actually quite an accomplishment. If you don't know much about Gur, I have a video dedicated to that you can check out later. When they did need to fight, because sometimes you just do, their leaders were at the front fighting valiantly to protect the lives of their soldiers. When the Age of Chaos came, their tranquility was stripped away, their people were killed and scattered, the armies of the kingdom roamed around the realm in shambles, and that's when the madness took over. They still see themselves at peace with their environment, but that definition has changed. Where the peace and tranquility, fitting into what Gur is, used to be about avoiding combat and just understanding how the realm works. Now it means they are roving predators just like everything else in Gur. Those are two very different but equally valid definitions of peace and tranquility and fitting in with the realm. They are highly mobile armies that ensnare the beasts of the realm to serve them. Again, their desire is to be at one with their surroundings, and this leads them to put pieces of Gur realmstone in their skin and just kind of become the realm around them. And this makes them one more aggressor in a very long list of predators in Gur. And that's pretty much all there is about them. It doesn't directly say it, but my assumption is that's why they use a high number of terrorgeists and zombie dragons, because they just tame the beasts of the realm. Now the last little thing here is a new unit that was unveiled to us, and that is the Regent. The Battle Tome gives us this new hero unit, and I wanted to cover the Grand Courts first to kind of give him some context. Flesheater Courts can now belong to a larger conglomerate, right? Those Grand Courts we just talked about, but who leads those? Who can organize the insanity and delusion of so many lesser courts? Well, this is the Regent, a new hero to fill the role of a new kind of tier of authority. The longer a Ghoul King exists, the stronger he becomes, because it makes sense, he's a vampire after all. His skin gets more leathery, he grows stronger and larger with more muscles, and he develops this increased fanaticism from his courtiers. It's as if his delusion he projects becomes stronger and deeper and more intense. Even enemies in battle can be completely swept up in the madness and turn on their friends. In fact, the infectious nature of this level of delusion, again, it's like that kind of magic infectiousness, it can corrupt other courts nearby. The dominance of his mind and will subsuming others around him, binding other courts to his will. Each Archregent rules over the Ghoul Kings and courts beneath him. Where a Ghoul King needs courtiers to be in control of his army, an Archregent, sheer projection of will, can do this. He doesn't need anyone else, he just is this big focal point of madness. Even though they are an evolved form of the Ghoul King, they have a very different temperament. See, Ghoul Kings are aggressive, they like to lead from the front, but as they age, their anger is kind of tempered, and it becomes cold and methodical, and Archregents, when they become kind of that level of leadership, lead from the back, moving entire courts as pawns in a huge chess game. It takes a lot to rouse one of them to battle, but when they do, they unleash pure hell. As you can see from the other things in our lore weeks, and also the inclusion of Grand Courts, it would be absolutely horrifying. So to sum up this video and complete the kind of addendum, videos to Flesheater Courts, why are these cool? Well, I think the biggest thing is that, I touched on it in the earlier part of this, was that because they are now pooling their resources and becoming a more unified threat, it takes the Flesheater Courts from being isolated, tacked on parts of the story arc to being big players. They have the potential to shape events because now they're getting bigger and more evolved and that kind of stuff. One thing I also like about this, and it's something I commented on with the Gloomspite Git series, is it's a real achievement to take an army that isn't Chaos or Stormcast, frankly, because those are the two ones we get books about most, and make them fit into the setting as deeply as some of these new battle tomes do. The origin stories of not only Flesheater Courts, but also some of these Grand Courts is directly tied to the places and the people that we know in the grander story, and that's important. It makes you feel like your army truly belongs and is not just tacked on. And I think that's really important because they can't make a Black Library book series dedicated to every single army. That's just a lot of literature and books and that are perspectives that are hard to understand. It would take a real talented author to make a good Flesheater courts from their perspective book. But what you can do is just fit an army so well into the setting that you don't feel like you're being left out. You don't feel like a stupid addition that was just an afterthought. You feel like you belong here. You can be a real challenge to the main characters, the main armies that do get that focus, and that's super important. I think adding the Grand Courts as well as the Archregent as a new tier of leadership was really important, and I'm thankful they did. Here's to hoping one day Forge World puts out an Archregent on a mega dead thing, just like they put out the Corn guy on his big old dragon. Something to kind of represent his steed, whatever he would ride to combat. That'd be kind of cool. But until that day, I think this lore adds a whole lot to the faction and just reinvigorates my love for it. So tell me your thoughts. First of all, what is your favorite Grand Court and why? It could be for rules purposes, it could be for lore purposes. And what do you think about the Archregent and how he fits into the greater narrative? Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little addendum series. I'm going to be putting it on the Flesheater Courts lore playlist, and I hope to see you in the comments in this video and back in those. Thank you so much for watching, and happy wargaming.